Part 3, Section 2 of The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. I pass on to the fifth passage called A Prophecy of Jesus Christ. This, like two of the former, is introduced by a dream. Joseph dreamed another dream, and dreameth of another angel. And Matthew is again the historian of the dream and the dreamer. If it were asked how Matthew could know what Joseph dreamed, neither the bishop nor all the church could answer the question. Perhaps it was Matthew that dreamed, and not Joseph. That is, Joseph dreamed by proxy in Matthew's brain, as they tell us Daniel dreamed for Nebuchadnezzar. But be this as it may, I go on with my subject. The account of this dream is in Matthew chapter 2, verse 19. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, and take the young child and its mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And he arose and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding being warned of God in a dream, here is another dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, He shall be called a Nazarene. Here is good circumstantial evidence that Matthew dreamed, for there is no such passage in all the Old Testament. And I invite the bishops and all the priests in Christendom, including those of America, to produce it. I pass on to the sixth passage called A Prophecy of Jesus Christ. This, as Swift says on another occasion, is lugged in head and shoulders. It needs only to be seen in order to be hooted as a forced and far-fetched piece of imposition. Matthew chapter 4, verse 12. Now when Jesus heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the seacoast, in the borders of Zebulun and Nephthalim, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, The land of Zebulun and the land of Nephthalim, by the way of the sea beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw great light, and to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is springing upon them. I wonder Matthew has not made the criss-cross row, or the criss-cross now, I know not how the priests spell it, into a prophecy. He might as well have done this as cut out these unconnected and undescriptive sentences from the place they stand in, and dub them with that title. The words, however, are in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, as follows. Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterwards did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the nations. All this relates to two circumstances that had already happened at the time these words in Isaiah were written. The one, where the land of Zebulun and Naphtali had been lightly afflicted, and afterwards more grievously by the way of the sea. But observe, reader, how Matthew has falsified the text. He begins his quotation at a part of the verse where there is not so much as a comma, and thereby cuts off everything that relates to the first affliction. He then leaves out all that relates to the second affliction, and by this means leaves out everything that makes the verse intelligible, and reduces it to a senseless skeleton of names of towns. To bring this imposition of Matthew clearly and immediately before the eyes of the reader, I will repeat the verse and put between crotchets the words he has left out, and put in italics those he has preserved. Begin crochet. Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted, end crochet, begin italics, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, end italics, begin crochet, and did afterwards more grievously afflict her, end crochet, begin italics, by the way of the sea beyond Jordan in Galilee of the nations, end italics. What gross imposition is it to gut, as the phrase is, a verse in this manner, render it perfectly senseless, and then puff it off in a credulous world as a prophecy. I proceed to the next verse. Verse 2. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined. All this is historical, and not in the least prophetical. The whole is in the preter tense. It speaks of things that had been accomplished at the time the words were written, and not of things to be accomplished afterwards. As then, the passage is in no possible sense prophetical, nor intended to be so, and that to attempt to make it so is not only to falsify the original, but to commit a criminal imposition. It is matter of no concern to us, otherwise than as curiosity, to know who the people were of which the passage speaks, that sat in darkness, and what the light was that had shined in upon them. If we look into the preceding chapter, the 8th, of which the 9th is only a continuation, we shall find the writer speaking at the 19th verse of witches and wizards who peep about and mutter, and of people who made application to them, and he preaches and exhorts them against this darksome practice. It is of this people and of this darksome practice, or walking in darkness, that he is speaking at the 2nd verse of the 9th chapter, and with respect to the light that had shined in upon them, it refers entirely to his own ministry, and to the boldness of it, which opposes itself to that of the witches and wizards who peeped about and muttered. Isaiah is, upon the whole, a wild, disorderly writer, preserving in general no clear chain of perception in the arrangement of his ideas, and consequently producing no defined conclusions from them. It is the wildness of his style, the confusion of his ideas, and the ranting metaphors he employs, that have afforded so many opportunities to priestcraft in some cases, and to superstition in others, to impose those defects upon the world as prophecies of Jesus Christ, finding no direct meaning in them, and not knowing what to make of them, and supposing at the same time they were intended to have a meaning, they supplied the defect by inventing a meaning of their own, and called it his. I have, however, in this place done Isaiah the justice to rescue him from the claws of Matthew, who has torn him unmercifully to pieces, and from the imposition and ignorance of priests and commentators, by letting Isaiah speak for himself. If the words walking in darkness and light breaking in could in any case be applied prophetically, which they cannot be, they would better apply to the times we now live in than to any other. The world has walked in darkness for 1800 years, both as to religion and government, and it is only since the American Revolution began that light has broken in. The belief of one God, whose attributes are revealed to us in the book or scripture of the creation, which no human hand can counterfeit or falsify, and not in the written or printed book, which, as Matthew has shown, can be altered or falsified by ignorance or design, is now making its way among us. And as to government, the light is already gone forth. And whilst men ought to be careful not to be blinded by the excess of it, as at a certain time in France, when everything was Robespierrean violence, they ought to reverence and even to adore it with all the firmness and perseverance that true wisdom can inspire. I pass on to the 7th passage, called A Prophecy of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 8, verse 16. When the evening was come, they brought unto him, Jesus, many that were possessed with devils, and he cast out the spirit with his word, and healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Esaias, the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities, and bare our sicknesses. This affair of people being possessed by devils, and of casting them out, was the fable of the day when the books of the New Testament were written. It had not existence at any other time. The books of the Old Testament mention no such thing. The people of the present day know of no such thing. Nor does the history of any people or country speak of such a thing. It starts upon us all at once in the book of Matthew, and is altogether an invention of the New Testament makers and the Christian church. The book of Matthew is the first book where the word devil is mentioned. Note, the word devil is a personification of the word evil. End note. We read in some of the books of the Old Testament of things called familiar spirits, the supposed companions of people called witches and wizards. It was no other than the trick of pretended conjurers to obtain money from credulous and ignorant people, or the fabricated charge of superstitious malignancy against unfortunate and decrepit old age. But the idea of a familiar spirit, if we can affix any idea to the term, is exceedingly different to that of being possessed by a devil. In the one case, the supposed familiar spirit is a dexterous agent that comes and goes and does as is bidden. In the other, he is a turbulent, roaring monster that tears and tortures the body into convulsions. Reader, whoever thou art, put thy trust in thy Creator, make use of the reason he endowed thee with, and cast from thee all such fables. The passage alluded to by Matthew, for as a quotation it is false, is in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 4, which is as follows. Surely he, the person of whom Isaiah is speaking of, hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. It is in the preter tense. Here is nothing about casting out devils, nor curing of sicknesses. The passage, therefore, so far from being a prophecy of Christ, is not even applicable as a circumstance. Isaiah, or at least the writer of the book that bears his name, employs the whole of this chapter, the 53rd, in lamenting the sufferings of some deceased person, of whom he speaks very pathetically. It is a monody on the death of a friend, but he mentions not the name of the person, nor gives any circumstance of him by which he can be personally known. And it is this silence, which is evidence of nothing, that Matthew has laid hold of to put the name of Christ to it, as if the chiefs of the Jews, whose sorrows were then great, and the times they lived in big with danger, were never thinking about their own affairs, nor the fate of their own friends, but were continually running a wild goose chase into futurity. To make a monody into a prophecy is an absurdity. The characters and circumstances of men, even in different ages of the world, are so much alike, that what is said of one may with propriety be said of many. But this fitness does not make the passage into a prophecy, and none but an impostor or a bigot would call it so. Isaiah, in deploring the hard fate and loss of his friend, mentions nothing of him but what the human lot of man is subject to. All the cases he states of him, his persecutions, his imprisonment, his patience in suffering, and his perseverance in principle, are all within the line of nature. They belong exclusively to none, and may with justice be said of many. But if Jesus Christ was the person the church represents him to be, that which would exclusively apply to him must be something that could not apply to any other person, something beyond the line of nature, something beyond the lot of mortal man, and there are no such expressions in this chapter, nor any other chapter in the Old Testament. It is no exclusive description to say of a person, as is said of the person Isaiah is lamenting in this chapter, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth." This may be said of thousands of persons who have suffered oppression and unjust death with patience, silence, and perfect resignation. Grotius, whom the bishop esteems a most learned man, and who certainly was so, supposes that the person of whom Isaiah is speaking is Jeremiah. Grotius is led into this opinion from the agreement there is between the description given by Isaiah and the case of Jeremiah, as stated in the book that bears his name. If Jeremiah was an innocent man, and not a traitor in the interest of Nebuchadnezzar, when Jerusalem was besieged, his case was hard. He was accused by his countrymen, was persecuted, oppressed, and imprisoned, and he says of himself, see Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 19, "But as for me, I was like a lamb or an ox that is brought to the slaughter." I should be inclined to the same opinion with Grotius, had Isaiah lived at the time when Jeremiah underwent the cruelties of which he speaks. But Isaiah died about 50 years before, and it is a person of his own time whose case Isaiah is lamenting in the chapter in question, and which imposition and bigotry more than 700 years afterwards perverted into a prophecy of a person they call Jesus Christ. End of Part 3, Section 2.